Well, thank you, and good morning once again. You know, brethren, we live in a society where people don't take commitments very seriously. One of the proofs of that is the number of lawyers we have in this country. You know, the United States has far more lawyers than any other country in the world. In fact, I was reading that one particular state, I'm not quite sure which one it is right now, but I'm sure there are a number of states, but this one particular one was mentioned, is having more lawyers in that particular state than the entire nation of Japan had. Now, you know, one of the reasons that there are so many lawyers is because people don't want to do what they've said they would do. So they're trying to get out of a commitment. And they get a lawyer, and he tries to help them get out of that commitment. That's not the only purpose a lawyer serves by any means, but it's one of the reasons there are so many. Because if everyone obeyed just one single commandment, just the commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness. What if everybody just kept that commandment? Everybody would not bear false witness. So if people agreed to something, they'd stick to that agreement. If it were a business agreement, if it were something, you know, if, let's say it involves an insurance claim. A lot of things involve, a lot of the rise in litigation is involved personal injury. That means that no one would bear false witness and claim that he had suffered some injury that he hadn't. No one would try to take advantage of someone by claiming that he was entitled to something that he wasn't. And of course, on the other hand, no insurance company would dream of trying to get out of its commitment and get out of the obligation that it had. No company would seek to evade responsibility. They wouldn't bear false witness and deny that they knew about certain things. Everyone would simply tell the truth. Well, it would revolutionize society. I mean, look at all the people that would throw out of work. Then they'd have to do something productive rather than be a party to something that is seeking to break down or to undermine commitments. I mean, you can look at many areas of our society. Look at the divorce rate. You know, there was a time when people said, I do. They walked down the aisle, they said, I do. And then a little while later, they didn't want to anymore. And it may have been for any number of reasons. It may have been because they got tired of it. They got bored. They saw somebody that they thought looked more interesting or exciting or any number of things. The point is that commitment doesn't mean a whole lot to many, many people. And we see that around us. We see in our entire society an undermining of taking seriously commitments that are made. Now, you know, it's interesting because the Scripture, on the other hand, has an awful lot to say about the subject of commitment and how seriously commitments are to be taken. Notice back in Revelation chapter 2, familiar Scripture in reference to the promises to one of the seven churches of Revelation 2 and 3. And let's pick it up, Revelation 2:25. This is the reference to the church at Thyatira. He says, but that which you have already, hold fast till I come, and he that overcomes and keeps my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations. He that overcomes and keeps my works unto the end. Now it's talking about an individual who has made a commitment and keeps that commitment. He keeps my works unto the end. He endures. He remains faithful. He perseveres, keeps my works unto the end. Now that's an important concept. God values not simply somebody starting out. You remember Christ told the parable of the one son of the man that had two sons, and he said, "Son, go work in the vineyard. I need you fellows to go out and work hard today." And one of them said, "Yes, sir, I'm on my way. Boy, I'm going to go out there. I'm really going to do it. You can count on me." Of course, as Christ went on and told the parable, he never went, did he? He didn't actually do what he said. He promised. He was the first guy on the sign-up list. You know, he was ready. But he never did it. Now, on the other hand, was one who didn't reflect a very good attitude. He said, no, I'm not going to go. I don't want to go. But then afterward, he thought about it and he repented. He felt badly, and he went and did it. And Christ said, now, which of those did the will of the Father? Well, obviously the one that actually went and did something. And then Christ, of course, applied that to the Pharisees, who outwardly made a commitment to obey God and to keep the commandments and to do all the things that were pleasing in the sight of God. And yet, they didn't, did they? You can go through the New Testament account and see various things about them. It's not enough just to start out good. It's not enough just to profess a commitment. It's not enough just to profess a belief. It's not enough simply to say something, to obligate ourselves to something, and then not to follow through. He that overcomes and keeps my works unto the end. The one who remains faithful. Now, Christ stated it a little differently in Matthew 24, where he talks about he that endures to the end, the same shall be saved. You see, again, that principle, someone who is following through with a commitment that was made. Let's go back to Matthew chapter 5. We were mentioned earlier in the sermon about the matter of litigation and all of the multiplying of attorneys in this land. And the reason attorneys are multiplying is not because people are seeking to understand the law and to understand what it is that they're supposed to do and to seek to be guided to learn that better. The reason attorneys are multiplying is because people are trying to evade and get out of. Now that's just the number that would be needed to guide people in terms of the law would be a far smaller number. But you see, because we live in a society where people don't want to keep their commitments, where, notice right here in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is talking about swearing. And in Matthew 5:34, he said, I say unto you, swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it's God's throne, nor by the earth, for it's his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, it is the city of the great king, neither shall you swear by your head, you can't make one hair white or black, but let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatsoever is more than these comes of evil. Christ said, look, make your commitment and stick by it. Your word should be your bond. You don't have to swear on a stack of Bibles and do all sorts of contortions and backflips to ensure that you're really telling the truth this time, as opposed from the rest of the time when you normally don't. I mean, that's the part of the distinction that's being made. One of the reasons Christ made the point about swearing is you're making a distinction that, okay, if you give with the right oath. Pharisees spent a lot of time debating on the validity of different oaths and how binding were certain oaths in comparison to other oaths. And if you swore by the temple, that was binding to a certain degree. If you swore by the gold in the treasury of the temple, that was even more binding. And they had all this silly reasoning, which Christ indicted them for. And he said, in effect, you fellas have missed the whole point. You've missed the whole point. You're looking for loopholes. You're looking for a way that you can sort of say something and yet you're not totally obligated because you said this, but you had sort of a loophole. Sort of like, you said it, but you had your fingers crossed and held behind your back or whatever the silly kind of things that people do. Little kids grow up learning that sort of thing in the playground. Oh, I didn't really mean it. I had my fingers crossed. That's an interesting thing if you go back to that and why did the sign of the cross absolve you from keeping what you said? What Christ said was, look, you say what you mean and mean what you say. Let your yea be yea and your nay, nay. If you have to start going into all sorts of things and various degrees of being bound or not bound by what you've said, you're getting into evil. You're getting into bearing false witness. You're making a distinction. between when you tell the truth and when you don't. Notice back in Psalm 15. In Psalm 15, David asked the question, Lord, who shall abide in your tabernacle? Who shall dwell in your holy hill? Who is it that is going to be with God for eternity? Will abide in His tabernacle, dwell in His holy hill. Here's the answer, verse 2. He that walks uprightly and works righteousness and speaks the truth in his heart. Not someone who is trying to deceive and sort of maneuver and manipulate, but speaks the truth in his heart. You know, we're told of God, Jesus said to the Father, He said, Thy word is truth. God's word is true from the beginning, we're told in Psalm 119. Jesus said in John 17:17, Thy word is true. God is true, and when God makes a commitment, you and I can absolutely count on it. That's what faith is based upon. Faith is based upon the fact that God is true and God's commitments will be honored by Him. God wants to be surrounded for eternity by those who share that value. They value truth. Now we're told, Jesus said, speaking of Satan, that he was a liar. He was a murderer from the beginning, a liar, and the father of a lie. In Revelation 12, we're told that Satan the devil has deceived the whole world. The first place we read about Satan is there in Genesis 3. And what do we find? He shows up there in the garden. Adam and Eve are there. And is he speaking the truth in his heart? Oh, absolutely not. He came through subtlety to deceive. You know, we're told about his subtlety. He was more subtle. Came to Eve and he said, in effect, a nice place you got here, beautiful place. Can you eat any of the fruit? I see all these trees and all this beautiful stuff. God let you have any of it? Oh, yes, we can eat all of the fruit of the trees of the garden, except for the one over here in the midst of the garden, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God has said, don't eat of it, don't touch it, lest you die. And Satan said, you shall not surely die. Now that was a lie. Adam and Eve are dead. Been dead for thousands of years. They violated what God said. God told them what would happen. They did it, and it happened. Those who speak the truth in their heart are the very opposite of the character and nature of Satan, who is a deceiver, who does not speak the truth in his heart, but is subtle and clever and trying to deceive and to mislead. One who is certainly cannot be counted upon to keep his commitments. So God talks about those who will dwell with Him forever. He that walks uprightly, works righteousness, speaks the truth in his heart. He that backbites not with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his neighbor, in whose eyes a vile person is condemned, but he honors them that fear the Lord. He that swears to his own hurt and changes not. He makes an agreement, he makes a commitment, and even when it comes out to be to his disadvantage, he still keeps it. Because he gave his word, he gave his agreement. And he does not try to go back on that. He that puts not out his money to usury, nor takes reward against the innocent, he that does these things shall never be moved. It's talking about the character, the kind of character that God values. And it involves the importance of commitments, the importance of speaking the truth in our heart, of sincerely meaning what we say and making every effort and endeavor to follow through with it. Now, God says that commitments are very important. What we say is important. Christ talked about that by our words we'll be justified and by our words we'll be condemned, that we're responsible, that even every idle word, we're responsible for what we say. We're responsible for the commitments that we make. Commitments aren't taken very seriously and are often not maintained. Now, it's interesting. I would like for us to take a little time and to look through the Scriptures and to see some examples. We're going to focus in on 3 individuals who did not maintain their commitments. And what we're going to see is that each of them had different reasons for not maintaining their commitments. There are different ways and different reasons that people may fail to keep their commitments. And there's a contrast between those who don't and those who do. And we'll see a little later what it is that makes that contrast. But let's look at an individual. One of the individuals that comes to my mind in the Scripture that certainly was a man who did not take seriously his commitments was Pharaoh back in the book of Exodus. Pharaoh with whom Moses dealt. Pharaoh was not a fellow to take his commitments very seriously. If you remember in Exodus chapter 5, Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, "Thus says the eternal God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness." Pharaoh said, "Who's the Lord that I should obey him? I don't know him. I'm not going to do that. Why should I?" So Pharaoh had his excuses as to why he wasn't going to do that. Then decided to really crack the whip and make things even harder on the Israelites. Well, as you come on through the story, we come here that God told Moses that he was to go back to Pharaoh and that he was to give certain signs to Pharaoh. And we find this in Exodus 7, that Moses and Aaron, verse 10, went to Pharaoh, and they did as God commanded. Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. And Pharaoh called the wise men and the sorcerers and the magicians, and they did in like manner with their enchantments. Aaron's rod swallowed up theirs, though. Well, that didn't accomplish a whole lot. And so a little later, Moses went out to go before Pharaoh in the morning when he went down to the water, to the Nile. And Moses said that the river was going to turn to blood. God had instructed him to do that. And verse 19, "Take your rod, stretch out your hand upon the waters of Egypt." And so the water became blood. And the magicians in Egypt were able to do something similar. So Pharaoh was still hardened. Well, in chapter 8, God told Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, "If you don't let my people go, I will smite your borders with frogs." And frogs were going to come up. So this is what happened. And notice in verse 8, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron, and he said, "Entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may do sacrifice." So now we come finally here to the third plague, and Pharaoh made a commitment. He said, "Would you please pray to God and ask him to get rid of these frogs? I'll let your people go." When I read this, I always think of the picture. You know, those of you who remember the Bible story that Basil Wolverton did many years ago. And he was quite a creative artist as well as a writer. And what I always remember is when he was going through this section of it, and he had this illustration of Pharaoh holding out his drinking cup, and Pharaoh's eyes were bulging out. There was a frog that was climbing up out of the cup. Well, I don't know if Pharaoh had a frog climb out of his cup, but it says that the frogs were everywhere. Verse 3, in your bedchamber, in your bed, in the house of your servants, upon your people, in your ovens, and in your kneading troughs. You get ready to make bread, and all of a sudden a frog pops out. There were frogs everywhere, and there may have been frogs climbing out of Pharaoh's cup in the morning. But that picture was just sort of worth 1,000 words as far as I was concerned. I can still visualize that picture every time I read this account. Pharaoh had all the frogs he wanted. In fact, he had More than enough frogs. So he made a commitment. He said, if you'll please get rid of these frogs, ask God to get rid of the frogs, and I will let your people go. So, Moses agreed to that, and he said, when do you want them gone? He said, well, I'd like them gone by tomorrow. And he said, fine. It'll be according to your word, verse 10, that you may know that there's none like the Lord our God, and the frogs shall depart. Aaron and Moses went out from Pharaoh. Moses cried unto the Lord. The Lord did according to the word of Moses, and the frogs died out of the houses. And they gathered them together upon heaps, and the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he hardened his heart, and hearkened not unto them as the Lord had said. Pharaoh reneged on his commitment. Now, one of the things you find in here, you read about God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Do you know how God hardened Pharaoh's heart? By showing him mercy. You see, Pharaoh was a fellow who wanted his own way. Pharaoh viewed himself as being above the law. There are people who don't keep their commitments because they don't think that anything really applies to them. They think the law is for other people. But somehow they're above the law. They can do what they want to do. Pharaoh was that way. Pharaoh only agreed to something when he was under extreme duress. When he was compelled. And he was in such a tight corner he could see no way out, Pharaoh would make an agreement. But as soon as Pharaoh got relief, he threw the agreement away. Pharaoh did not take seriously his commitments because in Pharaoh's mind he was above the law. He didn't have to, he could do whatever he wanted to do. One of the things that we will see that runs through all of a lack of taking commitment seriously, the characteristic that runs through all of it is self-centeredness. Self-centeredness is at the heart of breaking commitments. Pharaoh's life was centered on himself. What he wanted to do, what he felt like doing. He was a very self-centered individual. His whole life centered on himself. And so he didn't regard that he was obligated to do anything that he didn't want to do. So, the way God hardened his heart was by being kind, by being merciful. And once the frogs died, Pharaoh decided this problem was solved. Why should he let them go? Well, a little later on, in verse 16, the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron, stretch out your rod, smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice. They did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod, smote the dust, it became lice, and it was throughout the land. And the magicians couldn't duplicate this, and they told Pharaoh, verse 19, this is the finger of God. Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He was just determined he wasn't going to give in. So the next day, Moses met Pharaoh as he was coming up from the river. And verse 21, if you will not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies upon you and your servants. In verse 22, I'll sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell. No swarms will be there. And God did so. And Pharaoh then, verse 25, called for Moses and for Aaron, and he said, go and sacrifice to your God in the land. He tried to get them to compromise, and Moses would not do that. He said, verse 27, we'll go 3 days' journey into the wilderness. And so we find that in verse 32, Pharaoh said, look, I'll let you go. Verse 28, just don't go very far, and please pray for me, entreat for me. And so Moses went out and entreated God, and the swarms disappeared. And he told Pharaoh, end of verse 29, he says, but don't let Pharaoh deal deceitfully anymore in not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. Moses told him, he said, now look, I'm going to go and do what you asked. You asked me that I would go and pray God to get rid of these swarms, to get rid of this terrible plague. I'm going to do that. But last time I did that, last time you and I had an agreement, you cheated. You asked me to go and pray to God for the frogs to disappear, and I did. And as soon as I did, you backed out of the agreement. Now, don't do that again. Pharaoh stood there, I'm really going to keep my word this time. Well, the Lord did according to the word of Moses, verse 31. The swarms were removed. There remained not one. Verse 32, Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also, neither would he let the people go. He didn't take commitment very seriously. And so, the Lord told Moses, He said, well, you better go into Pharaoh and says, thus says the Lord God of the Hebrews, let my people go. And if you refuse, then the hand of the Lord is going to be upon your cattle. And there's going to be a terrible disease. And He appointed a set time. And sure enough, the plague came. And so it comes on down a little further. And then Moses, at God's instruction, took a handful of ashes and sprinkled it toward heaven, verse 8. And it became small dust, and boils began to break out all over people. The magicians, verse 11, couldn't even stand up before Moses. They were covered with boils, evidently had boils on the bottom of their feet. God was very clearly showing that His power far exceeded anything that the pagan gods of Egypt and their magicians could do. But Pharaoh wouldn't give in. And verse 13, God told Moses, He said, get up early in the morning, stand before Pharaoh, and says, thus says the Lord God of the Hebrews, let my people go, and I'm going to send all my plagues upon your heart and upon your servant. And I'm going to cause these various plagues. It's going to rain a grievous hail, verse 18. And so, this is, he didn't regard the word of the Lord. And we find in verse 22 that Moses followed through with what God said, and this terrible plague came. And verse 27, Pharaoh sent and called Moses and Aaron, and he said, I've sinned this time. The Lord is righteous, and I and my people are wicked. Entreat the Lord. I've had enough. Entreat Him that there be no more mighty thunderings and hail, and I'll let you go. You won't have to stay any longer. If you've got thunder, not just for a few minutes, but on and on and on, great rolls of thunder and flashes of lightning and hail just coming down, on and on and on. Not for a few seconds, not just for a few minutes, but for hours. That gets to be pretty frightening, pretty overwhelming. Pharaoh said, look, I know I've really made a mistake. Please, you can go ahead and go. Just ask God that there be no more mighty thunderings and hail. And Moses said, verse 29, as soon as I'm gone out of the city, I'll spread my hands upon unto the Lord, and the thunder will cease, and there won't be any more hail. That you may know that the earth is the Lord's. He said, but he said, I know something, Pharaoh. He said, I know you don't really fear God. I bet you're going to change your mind again. Well, Moses went out of the city, and he did just what he said. See, Moses kept his commitments. Moses made an agreement. He said, I'll go and ask God. God caused the hail to cease. Verse 34, when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunders were ceased, he sinned yet more, hardened his heart. He and his servants, the heart of Pharaoh was hardened. Neither would he let the children of Israel go, just as God had predicted. God says, I know that fella. He is absolutely hard-headed. Nobody can tell him anything. He thinks he's above the law. He'll make an agreement, and he won't do what he says. Well, we find that God sent Moses back. And he told Pharaoh in verse 3, how long will you refuse to humble yourselves? Let my people go. And he said, I'm going to send a plague of darkness. And it's going to be so dark you're not going to be able to see your hand in front of your face. And so Pharaoh said, well, look, why don't we sort of make an agreement here? Who are they that want to go? Verse 8. Let's make sure we understand. And Moses said, well, all of us. Our young, our old, our sons, our daughters, our flocks, our herds. We're all going. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, verse 10, why don't you go, you older folks, but the little ones better stay here. It might be dangerous out there. I'll look after the kids. So, what we find is that Moses disagreed, and he and Aaron were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. So then the plague of locusts came. And Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in haste, verse 16, and he said, I've sinned. Now, therefore forgive, I pray you, my sin, only this once. I'm just going to ask you one more time, please, forgive this and entreat the Lord that He'll take away this terrible thing. And so Moses went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord. And God sent a wind and blew the locusts away. And then we find, verse 20, Pharaoh wouldn't let them go. He still wouldn't do it. Wouldn't keep his word. Verse 21, the Lord said to Moses, this was the plague of locusts, now here's the plague of darkness. And again, verse 24, Pharaoh called to Moses and he said, go and serve the Lord, but let your flocks and your herds stay. I'll let the kids go. Moses said no. Very succinctly put it in verse 26, he said, not one hoof is going to be left behind. So Pharaoh wouldn't let them go. And so in chapter 11 and 12, we get into the plague of the firstborn. The climax of God's dealings here. So we find that the angel of the Lord came through at midnight, Exodus 12:29, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt died, from the firstborn of Pharaoh all the way down to the firstborn of captive in the dungeon. There was a great cry throughout Egypt. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron, and he said, rise up and get forth. Everybody, you, your children, your animals, everybody, get out of here. Take your flocks and your herds. And the Egyptians were urgent upon them. So they left. Well, that's not really the end of the story. Because when you get to chapter 14, what do you find? Pharaoh found out where they were. They were down there's a mountainous area on one side and the Red Sea on the other, and the way they came in was the only way back out. And Pharaoh said, I got them this time. He puts together all these chariots and horsemen and drew near. Over and over and over again, Pharaoh didn't keep his word. God wiped out his whole army this time. But Pharaoh hardened his heart every time he got relief. Pharaoh was not a person to take commitment lightly. He viewed that commitment was something that other people made to him. But he viewed himself as above the law. He didn't have to do what he said. And that approach has carried through, and there are still plenty of people who are that way. They sort of view themselves as above the law, and unless they're forced and compelled to do something where there's no wiggle room, they simply won't keep their word. They will agree to something, and if it's not something they want to do, they just won't do it. And the only way they'll do it is if they're made to. Now, that's not the only reason people don't keep commitments, though. Come on back to 1 Samuel. Let's look a little bit at the life of King Saul. Now, King Saul was a man who did not really keep his commitments very well either. But Saul's motivation was a little different. Saul wasn't just like Pharaoh. The results were similar in terms of a failure to keep commitments, but Saul approached it from a little different angle. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, we find that Saul had gathered a garrison or a group of troops to go and fight the Philistines. And they were in a real bind. They had been just terrorized by these invading Philistines who'd come in, sort of terrorized the land. A lot of people had abandoned their farms, and they were hiding in caves and places like that, mentions in 1 Samuel 13:6. And Saul, in verse 7, was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. So they were really nervous about this. Saul waited 7 days, according to the time set that Samuel had appointed. And Samuel didn't get there by the end of that, and the people began to scatter. And Saul said, bring here burnt offerings and peace offerings, and he offered the offerings. And sure enough, just about the time he finished, Samuel arrived. And Samuel said, what have you done? I gave you instructions to wait until I came, and you said you would do that. I told you to wait, that I would come, I would do these things, and then we would go forth. And Saul said, verse 11, well, I saw the people were scattering, and you didn't get here just when you said you would. And the Philistines were gathering themselves together, and I said, well, they're going to come down and attack me. And so I sort of forced myself and went ahead and offered a burnt offering. Samuel told Saul, you've done foolishly. We're going to see as we go on through a little bit, Saul was a person who was ruled by his anxieties and his fears. Saul would make an agreement, and Saul probably meant to do it when he said it. See, Saul wasn't like Pharaoh. Pharaoh never intended to keep his commitment. As soon as he had wiggle room, he was going to do something else. Pharaoh never intended to keep it. I think the indication as you go through, Saul meant it when he said it. But a little bit later, other things came up. Saul began to look around, get nervous, get worried. And his worries, his anxieties, his fears then caused him to do exactly the opposite of what he had promised. As you go through, you come on down a little further. Let's pick it up in chapter 15. Now, in chapter 15, we have the story of Saul being sent out to destroy the Amalekites. And Samuel shows up after the battle. He comes up there to Saul, and Saul comes out. He's real proud of himself. He says, I really done it this time. Oh, I did exactly what God said. And you read that here in verse 13 of 1 Samuel 15. Saul said, blessed be you of the Lord. I've performed the commandment of the Lord. Boy, I really did it this time. And Samuel said, well, what's all this lowing of oxen and bleating of sheep that I hear? Where's all that coming from? Oh, that. Well, you see, the people, they wanted to keep the best of the sheep and the oxen. They're going to sacrifice that to God. That's why we did that. We've gotten rid of everything else. And Samuel said to Saul, he said, you think God has as great a delight in burnt offerings as he does in obedience? Well, as it comes on down, turns out that Agag, the king of the Amalekites, hadn't even been slaughtered. You see, Saul said unto Samuel, verse 20, yes, I've obeyed the word of the Lord. I've gone the way that the Lord sent me. I've brought Agag, destroyed the Amalekites. The people took of the spoil of the sheep and the oxen. They did that. And finally, when Saul was really sternly corrected by Samuel, Samuel told him, rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Verse 24, Saul said to Samuel, I've sinned, I've transgressed the commandment of the Lord in your words, because I feared the people and obeyed their voice. Saul wanted to be popular. Saul really wanted people to like him. And so Saul would make a commitment, he would make an agreement. But you see, Saul wouldn't follow through if it appeared his actions would be unpopular. He was an insecure fellow, sort of fearful and always worrying about things. And he really wanted the approval of the people. And so when the people began to gripe and grumble about getting rid of some of these prized animals, Saul backed off. Now, he had made an agreement. Samuel had given him instructions, and Saul had said, yes, I'll do it. But when the people began to gripe and grumble a little bit and say, well, we really think this is pretty good, we ought to keep some of this, Saul didn't follow through with his commitment. Now, there are many others examples as you come on down. You read the story of David introduced into the account around this time, and David's slaying of Goliath. And we find that when David had slain Goliath after the battle, that chapter 18, verse 5, David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved himself wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war. He was accepted in the sight of all the people, in the sight of Saul's servants. And it came to pass as they came when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, with instruments of music. The women answered one another as they played. They had this song they were singing, and part of the refrain was, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Saul was very wroth. He really got upset. It displeased him. He said, they've ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed but thousands. Verse 9, Saul eyed David from that day and forward. You see, in Saul's mind, David was his problem. If he could get rid of David, all his problems would be solved. You ever known anybody like that? Their problem was always other people, other places, other things. If they could change other people, if they could change other places, other things, if they could change the around, they were convinced that everything would be okay with them. The problem was never them, it was everybody else. Saul didn't view that he had a problem. Well, he had a problem. His problem was David. If he could get rid of David, everything would be okay. Saul spent the rest of his life in a growing obsession with King David. Or he wasn't King David at the time. He was destined to be king. Saul spent the rest of his life in this growing obsession with David. In fact, as we go on through the account, we'll see that Saul became so absolutely obsessed with David, he couldn't even function as king. The whole nation was going to pot. Saul was chasing David all over the place. And he would make commitments over and over. You see, here, he gets into one of these moods and he throws the javelin. He's sitting there in a room. David's playing music. And Saul cast a javelin. David avoided out of his presence twice, verse 11. Saul was afraid of David. Now, as you come on down, David behaved himself wisely. In verse 15, wherefore when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. Everybody in Israel and Judah loved him. Now, Saul makes an agreement. Makes that David would marry his daughter. And Saul's whole purpose in making the agreement was to get rid of David. He sets up a stipulation that he thinks is going to get David killed. And so this goes on, and we find that David followed through with the agreement, and Saul gave him now his daughter. But the result was, verse 29, Saul was yet the more afraid of David. And Saul became David's enemy continually. All the while he was letting on, I'm glad to have you as a son-in-law, and welcome to the family, and you're a great fella. Saul didn't mean that. He was afraid of him. He was afraid of him because David was doing what he was supposed to do. And David was increasingly winning the respect and the love of other people. People there in the household of Saul and just the nation as a whole. David wasn't courting popularity. David was trying to do what was right. He was trying to do a good job. Saul had a real problem. Well, as you come on through the story, you find that Saul made various attempts. Finally, David knew that his life was in danger, and he fled. And we're told in 1 Samuel 21:10, David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul. He went to Achish, king of Gath. That didn't work out, so he departed, chapter 22, verse 1, escaped to the cave of Adullam. And various family members gathered there. And verse 6, when Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men that were with him, Saul then said, look, he's upset. He wants to get rid of him. He accuses everybody of conspiring against him, everybody of hating him. So the story comes on down that actually a number of the priests are destroyed. Saul gets so upset. As you come on down through the account, we find things that was told him. This is chapter 24, verse 1. Saul got word that David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi, and he took 3,000 men and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. David was trying to get as far out of Saul's way as he could. He was just trying to stay away, stay out of trouble. He didn't want to fight with Saul. Well, they come up there and they're looking for David and his men. And Saul comes to this cave, and he goes in to relieve himself. And it just so happens that David and his men are actually hiding in that very cave. Saul comes in after he sort of gets in to the opening part of the cave. He takes off this big outer robe, and he lays that down and goes on back sort of into a back area of the cave there. And then he comes back. Well, in the meantime, the men there with David, Saul sort of disappears back into the recesses of the cave. And the men that are with David say, God's delivered him into your hand. What more do you want? Well, David reached over there and got Saul's robe, and he took his sword and he cut the end of it off, cut the bottom of it off. And Saul came back, and he puts on the robe. It's dark in the cave. He reaches and gets his robe, puts on. About the time he steps out and gets outside in the daylight, well, they've cut off his robe. Looks like he's got a miniskirt on now instead of a robe. Well, people undoubtedly began to snicker about that. And David, we're told in verse 5, David's heart smote him. David began to feel bad. He'd made the king look ridiculous. And so David told his servants to wait, and he went out of the cave. And David cried out to Saul, verse 8, and he said, "My lord the king." And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed, and David made the point to him. He said, "Look, King, I know you've got it in your mind that I'm out to get you, that I'm trying to take the throne and I want to get rid of you." But he said, you were just in this cave. I cut off the skirt of your robe, but I could have just as easily killed you. I'm not after you. Well, Saul began to carry on, and in verse 16, Saul said, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, "You're more righteous than I am. You've rewarded me good, and I've rewarded you evil. And, I'm sure sorry." So Saul went home, verse 22, but David and his men, David didn't trust Saul. They got up to the hold. Well, a little bit later, as you come on through the account, in chapter 26, verse 1, Saul got word that David was hiding himself in the hill of Hachilah. And Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph. And he had these men. And David was in the wilderness. And David knew where Saul was. And Saul was out there looking for him. Well, again, David had the opportunity. He actually comes down at night. And this pitcher of water and this spear of Saul's is right up there by his pillow, by the head where he's sleeping. David sneaks down into the camp and takes that. And took the spear and the bottle of water, verse 12 of chapter 26, and nobody knew it. Well, then David went over and sort of got up on this hill, sort of across the valley, and cried out with a loud voice and says, in effect, "Hey, you better, Abner, you better wake up. I thought you were supposed to keep an eye on the king. You were supposed to be guarding him. I could have come in there and killed him if I'd have wanted to. Here, look, here's his spear. Here's the bottle of water. I could have finished him off." And Saul knew David's voice, verse 17. He says, "Is this your voice, my son David?" And David told him, verse 18, he says, "Why does my Lord pursue after his servant? What have I done? What have I done?" And Saul said, verse 21, "I've sinned. Return, my son David. I'll no more do you any harm. I've played the fool. I've erred exceedingly." And Saul went back home. Well, as you come on down through the story, did Saul really do what he said? No. Saul, over and over, his fears, his anxieties about what was going to happen. And the very thing Saul was afraid of the most, he brought onto himself by his behavior. Saul was afraid he was going to lose the kingdom. He was afraid that his kingdom, his dynasty would not endure. And he decided that the whole cause of that was David. The cause of it wasn't David. The cause of it was Saul. Saul would make agreements, but then he would get scared that things weren't going to work out, so he would not do what he said. Saul didn't carry through on... The reason God rejected him as king is because Saul could not be counted on to keep his commitments. Saul would make an agreement, but then he'd get scared and go do something else. And instead of learning from it, we all are buffeted by fear sometimes. David talks about in the Psalms, some of the fears that he had, and how you find David was, on the run for years trying to stay out of Saul's way. One of the Psalms, I think, expresses it very picturesquely, where David says, "Oh, that I had wings like some swift dove, fly away." You ever feel that way? Just like you're surrounded by things, you just wish you could sprout wings and fly. Just get away from it all. Well, David thought about that. He had to wrestle with fears. But you see, David says also in the Psalms, he said, "What time I am afraid, I'll trust in you." David knew the answer to fear and anxiety was to focus on God and to put trust in Him. Trust God and do what you're supposed to do. You see, that's ultimately the answer. There are those like Pharaoh who view themselves as above the law and never have any intention of doing what they say. There are others like Saul that may actually mean to do it at the moment that they say it. But then it becomes inconvenient. They get scared, they get worried, they get nervous, and maybe this won't work out, maybe that won't work out, and so they don't do what they said. Saul didn't. Now let's notice something else. Let's go to Matthew chapter 10. Matthew 10, we find that Jesus called 12 disciples and gave them power over unclean spirits and to heal all manner of disease. The name of the 12 apostles are these. Now we find that they're grouped in pairs. As you go through the other gospel accounts, you find that Jesus was preparing to send them out 2 by 2. And so he had them paired up. First, Simon called Peter and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus and Lebbaeus Thaddeus. Verse 4, Simon the Canaanite and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Christ sent out 6 teams of 12. He had them paired up. Now, we don't know a lot about some of these men. We know about Judas that he is the one who betrayed Jesus. You ever thought about why he did it? Judas was a man who had made a commitment. Judas was among those disciples that were there, that listened and were being taught by Jesus. He was one of the 12 that were selected out of that group to be ordained and set apart as apostles. Judas was sent out here to preach the gospel, to heal the sick, to cast out demons, and there's no indication that the disciples came back and they were all excited and rejoicing that even the demons were subject to them in the name of Christ. There's no indication that Judas was the odd man out. He didn't come back and say, none of that worked for me. No, every indication is Judas preached the gospel. He went around he and Simon, they went various places, the 6 of them. Christ mapped out, we're just given the outline here, but you put all the gospel accounts together. Christ sent them out and dispersed over an area, and they were to go and to preach in certain cities, and then he was going to, they were to return back to him. They were to go to certain places before he got there. And he gave them instructions, and he told them to preach and to heal and to cast out demons. And they did. And Judas was part of the group. Judas was there. He had a commitment. He had professed a commitment to Jesus Christ as the Messiah. Judas followed him over these years. Now, one of the things that's sort of interesting in verse 4, it mentions that he was paired with a man by the name of Simon the Canaanite. Now, this expression, at this point in history, this term, Cananean, is I think more the Greek term, and in other places it's Zelotes. It was not, the term had to do with a description of that group of people who were a part of a movement to throw out the Romans and to reinstitute an independent Jewish state. Simon, before Jesus called him, before he became a disciple of Jesus, Simon was a part of what we would today sort of label as the militia movement of the day. He was a part of this group. They went through training exercises in the desert, and they were involved in various things, including robberies and murders and various things that they used that in their mind were steps toward the overthrow of the Romans and the reinstitution of an independent Jewish state. The term of Canaan meant had to do with that so-called patriotic movement, or the Zealots, as they're also better known. Now, he's linked with Judas, and we find that many of the others that were linked together were special friends. We know that there was a certain connection between many of these others. Perhaps Judas and Simon had some special connection. Judas may have had some background or association with that same movement. We know that all of the disciples heard Jesus preach over and over again about the establishment of the kingdom of God. And they were in anticipation that the kingdom was going to be established soon. However, as time went by, it's apparent that Judas became dissatisfied with the way that Jesus was going about things. Notice in Matthew 26. Now, in Matthew 26, in verse 6, Jesus was in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. And there came unto him a woman having an alabaster box of very precious ointment, and poured it upon his head as he sat at meat. And when his disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, to what purpose was all this waste? Now, just hold your spot here. Let's go back to John 12. We're going to come back to Matthew 26, but notice here in John 12, "6 days before Passover," John 12:1, Jesus arrived in Bethany. And the first night that he was there, he went to the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And they had a big meal, and Martha served. Lazarus was there at the table. Mary came in, verse 3, with this pound of ointment, this very expensive ointment. And she anointed the feet of Jesus. And the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. And one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, said, why wasn't this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? This is worth almost a year's salary, or a year's wages for a laboring man. Look at all the people that could have helped. Now, John adds in, this he said not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and he had the bag. Jesus said, let her alone. Now, this was 6 days before Passover. The account in Matthew 26 is just perhaps a couple of days later, 2 or 3 days later. He's at another house in Bethany, Simon the leper's. A similar incident comes up. It's different. In John 12, it was Mary in her own house that poured the ointment on his feet. Now he's in Simon the leper's home, and a woman takes this box and pours it on his head. So it's a similar incident, but it's different, 2 or 3 days later. But notice, when the disciples, plural, saw it, they had indignation and said, to what purpose was this waste done? You know, Judas had voiced his complaints a couple of days earlier. And there were others that must have looked around and thought, well, yeah, that is sort of wasteful. Now the same thing happens 2 or 3 days later. And there's several of them that began to complain. Judas, undoubtedly, this was not the first time he had ever criticized Jesus. How many times had Judas sort of made a look or an expression or whatever it was to some of the others, to Simon, the zealot, or some of the others, and made some comment, sort of rolled his eyes. Why in the world did he do that? Just a little dig, just the fact that, it doesn't seem to me that's a very good way to do it. Judas had a better idea of how things ought to be done, at least in his mind. He wanted the Romans thrown out. He wanted Jesus to go ahead and set up the kingdom. He had the perfect opportunity when he made this triumphal entry. But he didn't do it. Jesus didn't do things the way Judas thought he should. And Judas was increasingly getting perturbed. Now, some way or another, Judas excused the fact that he had started skimming off some of the money. We don't know how early he started that. I suspect that right after he did it, perhaps the very next morning, all Jesus had to do was look over at him. And, of course, Judas felt guilty and he felt resentful. He didn't feel guilty in the sense of repentance, but he resented it and made him feel, sort of agitated and sort of guilty. I suspect Jesus evidently never confronted him with it. I suspect just looking him in the eye, that was sufficient. Judas began to chafe under that. Maybe he had taken exception to the way he obviously felt like Christ was being pretty extravagant in these two cases. Had there been other situations, different circumstances, where he had objected to the way that Jesus used money that was given to him? At some point along the line, he justified in his own mind that what he was doing was okay, because if you're doing something you shouldn't do, you have to have a way of rationalizing it to yourself. You have to have a way to justify it, because you can't live with yourself and keep on doing it unless you have some way to rationalize, justify, excuse. The point was, Jesus didn't do things just the way Judas thought he should. Now, this event, recorded in Matthew 26, sort of brought things to a head. There had been an occasion 2 or 3 days earlier where Judas had voiced complaint and made some comments, and Christ made a very sharp rejoinder. Told him to leave Mary alone. Now, here this other incident happens, and this gets a few others stirred up. And Christ rebukes them very sharply, and he says, leave her alone. Against the day of my burying, she's doing this. Verse 14 of Matthew 26, Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went unto the chief priests, and said unto them, What will you give me, and I'll deliver him unto you? And they covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver. From that time he sought opportunity to betray him. Well, you know the story. He did betray him. Christ was arrested, was taken in, was interrogated before the Sanhedrin, was brought before Pilate, was given this terrible beating. And now we find that morning, perhaps about the time that after Jesus had been delivered to Pilate and was condemned, he was going to be taken out and executed. Notice Matthew 27. When morning was come, verse 1, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. When they had bound him, they led him away, delivered him to Pilate, the governor. Then Judas, which had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned. This would have been after now he's come out from Pilate's palace and is on his way to the hill to be crucified. When Judas saw that he was condemned, he repented himself and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I've sinned, I've betrayed innocent blood. They said, what's that to us? He cast down the piece of silver and the pieces of silver and departed and went and hanged himself. Then the chief priests got into this great dispute about what they were going to do with the blood money. He said, I don't think this is lawful to put in the temple. All of a sudden they were concerned about the law. They weren't concerned about paying money to betray somebody to be killed. But they were concerned now about putting it back in the temple. Decided that what they do is buy a field and use it as a pauper cemetery. But what I want to call your attention to is we don't know exactly what Judas had in mind, but evidently things didn't go exactly the way he thought they would. Because when Judas saw Jesus being led away to be executed, this wave of remorse swept over him. He was horribly upset and depressed. He went to take the money back. Did Judas think that somehow if he set things in motion that he could force Jesus to come on out with it and set up a kingdom right then? Did he think that somehow he could orchestrate things? You see, Judas was a controlling sort of fellow. Judas wanted everything done Judas's way. And he resented when everybody else didn't read their lines in the script the way he had written. Judas became resentful increasingly of Jesus because Jesus didn't do things just the way Judas thought he should. You know, some people are very controlling. They want to fix everything and everybody to do just what they want them to do. And if people don't, they get upset. They can't just live and let live. No, everybody's got to do what they want them to do. Judas was evidently that sort of fellow, and it increasingly bothered him that Jesus wasn't being the kind of Messiah that Judas thought he should be. And he complained and bellyached and found fault with various things. And evidently decided that he was going to force the situation. Well, it didn't go at all the way he thought it was going to go. And now, Jesus, horribly brutalized and bloody, barely recognizable, was staggering and stumbling out of the city gate to go up to the place where he would be executed. Judas saw it and felt horrified at what he had set in motion, because whatever plan or plot he had in mind, things obviously hadn't gone exactly the way he wanted them to. You see, Judas had a commitment. He had a commitment that he had made to Jesus as the Messiah, along with the others. He had followed, he had listened, he had been taught, he had gone out, he had done things. He had been sent out by Jesus. But Judas didn't follow through with his commitment because Judas got so busy trying to have things be done his own way that he tried to take things into his own hands and to force it to be his way. Very sad and tragic end. You know, people violate commitments for a variety of reasons, and we've only looked at three. You could, I'm sure, go through and come up with other reasons. But you can look at Pharaoh, who never intended to keep his commitments anyway. In his mind, he was above the law. He wanted his way, and he'd do whatever he wanted to do. And the only commitment he'd ever keep is what he was compelled to keep. You look at Saul, on the other hand, who probably intended to do good things, but Saul wanted to be popular, and so Saul's commitment to God was undermined by what people thought, and his desire to get their approval, and his fear and his anxiety that began to grow until it just consumed him. And Saul couldn't keep his word because he was too worried about the consequences, that things wouldn't work out good if he did what he said. Judas, on the other hand, a very controlling individual who became eaten up with resentments because others in general, and Jesus in particular, wasn't doing exactly what Judas thought they ought to do the way he thought they ought to do it. And it led him into a terrible betrayal. The breaking of a commitment because Judas was trying to force things to work out the way Judas wanted them to work out. And they didn't. You know, there's a difference between those individuals who, for whatever reason, did not continue in the commitments that they made. There's a contrast that's provided in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, we read of individuals like Abel and Enoch who recognize that without faith it's impossible to please God. He that comes to God must believe that He is, and He's a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. God keeps His commitments. He's a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. You see, without faith, faith is belief and trust in the veracity of God. Noah believed God, and because he believed Him, he prepared an ark. Abraham believed God, and because he believed Him, he left where he was and went to where God told him. Dwelt in tabernacles, temporary dwellings with Isaac and Jacob. Verse 10, for he looked for a city which has foundations. We read of Sarah, who through faith received strength. Verse 13, we're told these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. You see, they saw the promises far off. They were persuaded of them. They hadn't received those promises, but they believed in the veracity of God. They believed in God's commitment. That was real too. They saw it afar off, were persuaded of it. You see, Abraham and the other men and women of faith made a commitment to God. They believed God. And they made a decision based on what God said. They desire a better country, a heavenly. God's not ashamed to be called their God, verse 16. Well, you go on down through various ones, and you read about Joseph and Moses down in verse 24. That by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose rather to suffer affliction with God's people. He viewed that the pleasures of sin for a season were not worthy to be compared with obedience, with reproach for Christ. That was greater riches. Being reproached for the name of God was greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. He chose rather to suffer affliction than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Because you see, Moses believed God. He believed God. And based upon that belief, that faith, he made a commitment. You can read of all these individuals who, as we're told in verse 39, these all, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise. But they died in faith. They died persuaded of the veracity of the will and purpose and truth of God, of the promises of God. They believed that. We have this great cloud of witnesses. And so we see all these men and women. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, we're told to lay aside the weight and the sin that easily besets us, and to run with patience the race set before us. You see, we're not running a 50-yard dash. We're not running a little short race. We're running an endurance race that tests our commitment. And there will be a variety of things that come along. We're to look to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame. You see, one of what Jesus had and what all the men and women of faith had is they saw what lay in front of them. They saw the reason and the purpose for which they were doing what they were doing. And so their commitment was to God because they saw the promises and were persuaded of those promises. They believed God. And because they believed Him, they were prepared to act on what He said. Brethren, we could go on through Hebrews chapter 12 and 13. But you know, Hebrews 13:8 tells us Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Yesterday, today, and forever. The same one who dealt with Abraham and Moses, the same one who walked the face of the earth as a human being, the same one who is at the right hand of the Father on high, who is there to help us, to intercede for us, the same one who is going to return and rule as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, He's the same. He's consistent with God, with whom there's no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Have you considered the commitment that God has to you and me? God requires an absolute commitment of us. But you know, Notice what it says in Romans chapter 8. Verse 31, what shall we say then to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? If God has given a commitment, what does it matter what anybody else says or does or thinks? How deep does God's commitment go? How committed is God to you, to your salvation? He that spared not His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how shall He not with Him also freely give us all things? How committed is God to you and to me? He that spared not His own Son. God was so absolutely, totally committed, He made the ultimate sacrifice in your behalf and in mine. He gave His own Son. Now, His Son has been resurrected, ascended to the heavens, seated at the right hand of the Father. How shall He not also with Him freely give us all things? You think God's going to slack off on His commitment now, after He's gone through all of that? You think Jesus Christ is going to slack off on His commitment now, after He's gone through all of that He went through? Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It's God that justifies. Who is He that condemns? It's Christ that died, yea, rather that is risen again, and is even at the right hand of God who makes intercession for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Who is going to drive a wedge that distances us from the commitment that God the Father and Jesus Christ have for us? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? As it is written, for your sake we're killed all the day long. We're accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Knowing all these things, we're more than conquerors through Him that loved us. I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Absolutely nothing that can come between us and the love of God, cut us off from God's commitment to give us the help we need. He loves us. He gave His only begotten Son for us. How shall He not also now with Him freely give us all things? He's not going to withhold anything you and I need to make it. God is absolutely committed to us. But brethren, we have to respond with an absolute commitment to Him. To be committed to Him. Turning our life and our will over into His hands. Being absolutely committed. Various things can get in the way and interfere with commitment. We could go through, and there are many other examples. I've just picked out 3. But we can't afford to let anything interfere with our commitment to God, because He's committed to us. And as we walk with Him and yield to Him, seeing the promises, being persuaded of them, that commitment will take us all the way into the kingdom of God.